colonial legal codes were devised to justify slavery, and the Pequot War and King Philip's War were fought in large measure to perpetuate slavery. You see, they were just doing, and they created these wars, right, just so they can perpetuate slavery. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. All right, Columbia University, 1913. All right, so now we're going to go to page 118. All right, so this would be chapter 5 in this book, and it says here processes of enslavement. All right, because there's different ones. So this topic, this chapter would talk about warfare. All right, so of the processes in vogue among the English for the acquisition of Indian slaves, the most productive was that of warfare. With the exception of the Pequot War and King Philip's War in New England, the Indian wars in the English colonies were confined to the South, and there the greatest number of Indian war captives were enslaved. All right, where? In the South. From the beginning of the colony, the settlers of Carolina were in trouble with the Indians. In September 1671, war was declared against the Cusco, a tribe on the southern frontier who posed as allies of the Spaniards. All right, so this tribe was allied with the Spaniards, the Cusco, and who vexed the Carolina settlers with petty depredations. The Cusco were quickly defeated, and the prisoners sent to be sold out of the colony, unless ransomed by their countrymen. During the war with Stono Indians in 1680, the captive Indians were brought to Charleston and sold by Governor West to the traders in the colony to be carried to the West Indies as slaves. Again, Indians, right, being sent to the West Indies as slaves or servants. We're in the website called Chronicle.com, and this is the Chronicle of Higher Education. Do you want some higher education, or do you want to follow fantasies and fairy tales, right? This is by Margaret Ellen Newell, again, I believe the same author of the Brethren by Nature book. And it says, ruthless European slave traders, emptying villages and forcing terrified victims onto ships bound for the Atlantic. Lines of chained humans marching toward the slave markets under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Violent slave owners using torture and rape to force more work out of their captives. These searing images might bring to mind the terrible history of African slavery in the United States. But in fact, listen to this, my people, they actually describe historical events in the Bahamas, Central Mexico, and the American continent's western frontier. And the slaves were Indians, not African. They were Indians. These pictures, they were pointing in your head, right? What the movie Roots tries to put in your head, that they're Africans, are actually what happened in real historical events in the Bahamas, Central Mexico, and the American continent's western frontier. And these slaves were your ancestors, you so-called Negro Indians. This image is about to change, though. Thanks to a slew of works on Native American slavery, a relatively new field that gained energy from the explosion of interest in American Indian studies since the 1980s. So when people actually started really studying actual historical written chronicles and facts and records, all right, it's when you started realizing there was actually a Native American slave or American Native slavery, because they tried to hide it. They didn't tell us. They kept this part out of the textbooks. Recent research has shown us that most enslaved persons in the Americas before 1700 were Indians. Before the 1700s were Indians. That Indians constituted a sizable proportion of the global slave population thereafter, and that Europeans enslaved Indians from Quebec to New Orleans and from New England to the Carolinas. Works such as Pekka Hamalainen's The Comanche Empire, Yale University Press, have explored changing traditions of slavery within Native American societies, while other scholars, notably Alan Galley and Brett Rushforth, have tackled the enslavement of Indians by French and English colonists. All right, so we're in the book now. It's called Indian Slaves from Caribana, Trade and Labor in the 17th Century, Caribbean. So the 1600s, right? 1600s. Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. All right, so there's research behind this, okay? And her sources, you'll see in her footnotes, are very scholarly, all right, and historical. And it says here, abstract, or I guess like the introduction. It says here, indigenous resistance made Caribbean colonization a slow and violent process in the period of 1580 to 1690. All right, again, 1580, 1690. The Caribbean Indians who rejected colonization became targets for enslavement. Slavers captured indigenous people in raids or through trade within indigenous-dominated territories. I conceptualize this space as Caribana. Geographically, it stretched from Guyana northward throughout islands of the Lesser Antilles. I focus on the indigenous captives from Caribana who were enslaved in English and Dutch colonies, namely Barbados, Curaçao, and Suriname. I show how colonists justified enslaving indigenous people in the same manner as they justified the transatlantic African slave trade. All right, so she's telling you, just like the so-called transatlantic slave trade, it was happening here way before that. Just like it, despite widespread taboos against the former practice and not the latter. You see? So, because they always acknowledge the latter, right, which is called the transatlantic, but we already know that's in reverse, but they ignore what's happened before the so-called transatlantic slave trade happened. These taboos did not prevent Indian slavery, but they influenced the creation of 17th century histories, government reports, and other material for public and European consumption. Indian slavery has thus been written about, then and now, as limited phenomenon, wherein Indians had limited and specific labor roles, example as fishermen or domestic servants, indentured servants, encomienda. However, sources such as deeds and tax rolls show that more Indian slaves than assumed contributed a broad range of skills to plantations economies. So more Indian slaves assumed, meaning more than what they have told us, actually contributed to a broad range of skills to plantation economies. English Barbados was exceptionally successful because it was geographically separated from the conflicts that created captives in Caribana, but nevertheless extracted Indian slaves from the region. Meanwhile, colonies abuting Caribana, such as Suriname, faced trade sanctions from neighboring Indians and rebellions if they abused the Indian slave trade. Indian slave trade. From 1670s to 1690s, colonial governments limited the means of accessing Indian slaves, but once enslaved, they faced the same restrictive black codes. You hear this? Black codes that allowed the brutal treatment of them as inheritable chattel. All right, we're just talking about American Indians, not Africans. Now I want to read this to you. It's called here, The Forgotten Story of American Indian Slavery. Very good article I found online. It says this article is one of many in the Educational Teacher's Guide, South Carolina Indians Today, edited by William Morrow Goins, PhD. So this is to help, I guess, the teachers in South Carolina. When Americans think of slavery, our minds create images of Africans inhumanly crowded aboard ships, plying the Middle Passage from Africa, or of blacks stooped to pick cotton in southern fields. We don't conjure images of American Indians chained in coffles and marched to ports like Boston and Charleston, and then shipped to other ports in the Atlantic world. Yet Indian slavery and an Indian slave trade were ubiquitous in early America. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, tens of thousands of America's native peoples were enslaved. Many of them transported to lands distant from their homes. All right, tens of thousands of America's native people were enslaved. All right, and they were taken to distant lands. And how were they taken there? Ships. They didn't have teleportation machines or planes. Ships. Our historical mythology posits that American Indians could not be enslaved in large numbers because they too readily succumbed to disease when exposed to Europeans, and they were too wedded to freedom to allow anyone to own them. Yet many indigenous people developed resistance to European diseases after being exposed to newcomers for well over a century. You're still here. And it is a racist conception that inferior Africans accepted their debased position as slaves, a status that American Indians and Europeans presumably could never have accepted. This is gross misconception of history. We are just scratching the surface of what this all means. Alright? We're just scratching the surface. And we're going to show you. I'm showing you. For the enslavement of Indians forces us to rethink not only the institution of slavery, but the evolution of racism and racist ideologies in America. It's all linked. In the 17th century, Europeans, Africans, and American Indians all accepted slavery as a legitimate social institution called Making Indians White, the judicial abolition of native slavery in revolutionary Virginia and its racial legacy. The Virginia tribes and the ongoing struggle for federal recognition. Although Virginia elites assumed after robbing that natives had disappeared from their society, Indians hid in the plain sight, subsumed into the free black population of the state. Indians hid in plain sight. You are there in plain sight. You've been there. Subsumed into the free black population. Free black, that was always you. Free colored, we already know this. Despite significant intermixing, the law maintained a strict division between Indians and blacks. Only natives with less than 1/4 African blood were considered Indians, the one drop, right? While the rest were labeled colored. So they were doing meeny, miny, mo. He's colored, he's Indian. He's colored, he's Indian. He's colored, Indian, colored, Indian. Yeah, they were just throwing words out there and classifying you. The descendants of Indians even possessed court-issued certificates that testified to their native ancestry and protected them from the numerous legal restrictions imposed upon free blacks. So much changes when they labeled you something else. When your neighbor could be your cousin, your brother, and he's entitled to political, right, privileges, social privileges that you're not. The need for such documents suggests that Virginian Indians are indistinguishable from their African American neighbors in the eyes of whites. Again, the need, listen up, the need for such documents. Why do you need to prove? Why do you need to prove you're an Indian if Indians and Africans are supposed to look totally different? But the reality is that Indians, to the white Virginians, appeared physically indistinguishable from their African American neighbors because it's all you, it's the same person, it's the same family in the eyes of the whites. In the 1920s, eugenicists even concluded that the remnants of the Virginian tribes could not possibly be true Indians since they looked black. And who's the dude who started eugenics, the eugenics movement? I believe it was Charles Darwin's brother. These people had an agenda. We already heard the scientific dogma emerging, right? That was making Africans, if you were called African, right, then you were less human and you can be enslaved. Or basically, you're dark-skinned. And that was all Darwinism, eugenics did the same. Again, eugenicists concluded that the remnants of the Virginian tribes could not possibly be true. Black. They looked black. They aren't black. They looked. Crayon color. There's no such thing as a crayon color. You don't look black. You can't look black. They're saying that you were dark skinned. They're saying that you look like a Negro. That these Indians can't be true Indians because they look like Negroes. That's what they're saying. The response was a series of so-called racial integrity laws that, among other provisions, excluded anyone with more than 1/16 Indian blood from being white. An Indian identity was finally erased from Virginian records. Legally, all Virginians became either black or white. Either black or white. No more mulatto. Virginia had at last completed the long process of Robin began of dismantling Indians' ambiguous racial status. It had obliterated the state's triracial past from its laws. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this attempt consisted largely of the civilization policy, a concerted effort to turn tribes away from their traditional economies and convert them into sedentary farmers. The 1887 Dawes Act forcibly imposed this goal on Indians living on reservations. We got a little bit of the Dawes Act, right, before. By parceling communal tribal land into individual farming plots and selling off the excess, with the aim of undermining tribal identity. This policy was reinforced by the common practice of forcing Indian children into boarding schools to kill the Indian. You hear this, right? Forcing Indian children into boarding schools to kill the Indian and save the man, they said. And by a series of Supreme Court cases affirming federal plenary power to regulate tribes, internal affairs, even in violation of treaties that granted tribal sovereignty. Although in the 1930s, the Indian New Deal's restoration of Indian self-determination rectified some of the damage these 19th century policies caused. After the Second World War, the federal government returned to a policy of acculturation known as termination, by which it sought largely unsuccessfully to end its relationship with tribes and encourage Indians to move to large cities in the hope that they would assimilate.
Because at that time, they did not talk about being Indians because you could be jailed, correct?
Exactly. Right. There was a lot of bad things that could have happened to you if you were native and if you were caught off the reservation. In some cases, you could be shot on sight. Okay. But getting back to William Lamb, who Paramore and Floyd Painter, Paramore wrote the history of Southampton County, said was the last Chernock-Anotaway riding a bicycle in Cortland. Again, we know that was not true because William Lamb Howell, who was my war chief, is his grandson. But that's typical of what happened to first Americans in the Commonwealth. How things were done to actually change, not only to change one's race, but to change one's ethnicity, to take away their traditions, to take away their cultures, etc. And I'd like to go back to the 1808 Chernock-Anotaway Indian census to my fifth foster great-grandmother, who was Queen Edith Turner. Her name was really Wane Runsira, but the whites called her Turner. And the names, the colonial names, were given to us the same basically as the slave mentality. If your mother was a slave and living on a reservation, that means your child was a slave and that you took on the name of the master. So what had happened with Native people, we didn't have colonial names. We had Native names, but the whites called her great-grandmother's name was Carahoot. That was her native name. But when they did the census, they pinned her as being Mary Polly Whitson, who married Pearson's Turner and became Mary Turner and went over to Artistown in 1825 along with the Bozeman, the Browns, the Artists, the Boones, and the Whitsons, and just stayed there until the early 19th.
From the book Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. We're almost done, I just want to finish off with the info here. It says here, after being expelled from Brazil in 1654, the Dutch, or many of them, and the Portuguese Jews who had joined them, retreated with slaves. Again, Portuguese Jews. And they retreated with slaves, servants, and a plantation ideology to other places, and they're talking about other places in America. For example, 900 such persons, free and slave, left Brazil and migrated to Guadeloupe and Martinique. In addition, the Dutch had been actively selling slaves in the French islands, as noted. We know that many of the slaves on the islands were Brazilians, not Africans. Americans from Brazil and Arawaks, perhaps from the Guyana coast, Guyana, in South America. In 1656, some 20 Brazilian slaves helped suppress an Angolan rebellion on Guadeloupe. As late as 1767, the Brazilian term Mamaluco was still being used on Martinique. The Dutch, along with the French and English, were active along the Guyana coast, and that's in South America again, during this same period. The Dutch in particular developed for a time a route from the Essequibo River via the Rio Negro, again, Rio Negro, that's the real name of the Amazon. It was originally called the River Niger, or Negro, to the Amazon, bringing back canoe loads of slaves to the coast from the Amazon, slaves, not from Africa. They made peace with the Locono, Arawak people of Suriname, and by the late 1680s with the adjacent Carib groups. The friendly tribes, especially the Caribs, continued to supply the Dutch with American slaves from the interior until the mid-19th century. The island of Curaçao was also used by the Dutch as a center for the resale of slaves, and it would appear that Americans were still being obtained along the wild coast of South America well into the 19th century. That's the 1800s. All right, so they're letting you know, all right, that, the Dutch were enslaving American Indians since the 1500s all the way up into the 1800s, 300 years. How many of them? Thousands and thousands, right? Who was keeping track, really? The ultimate disposition of the... I just want to pause it right there, because I think this was this is a bomb right here, because they're letting you know that Angola was actually a colony of Brazil, of Brazilians. All right? So it seems like they were actually transporting a lot of Brazilians over there. And a group of Brazilians were the ones who did this company, and they created a colony over there, all right, with the help of the Dutch. So what is this Royal African Company? Are we looking at it in reverse? They tell us the story in reverse. That's they're telling you right here. Now, I haven't talked about it in this video, but if a lot of people, you're reading Jack Forbes. Have you seen the sources Jack Forbes uses? Have you verified the sources that he uses? Same ones I'm finding in the archives, same ones I'm using, man. And that's what I do. I verify information. I don't just read a book and be like, oh, this is absolute truth. You got to take the babies out and everything, and you got to verify the info. And, what they're saying right here about Brazilians having a colony and actually in Angola, it makes sense for what we're learning now. All right. The American slaves from the Suriname, Orinoco, Amazon watersheds, and the Curaçao region is not known to me. Some Suriname area natives were sent to Barbados from 1627 to help develop the sugar industry there. Perhaps others were sold with black Africans, let's touch the hijack, to all available markets, or were taken to Dutch colonies in Africa and elsewhere. Again, taken to Dutch colonies in Africa and elsewhere. Do you know the Dutch colonies in Africa, what those countries are? Yes. All right. So a lot of Americans were taken to those countries. During all this period, Americans were held as slaves or were being enslaved in Brazil. This was true in the Amazonian region, where Native American labor was in constant demand for the Para-Sierra area. One Jesuit estimated that 3 million Indians were descended as slaves from the Rio Negro alone. We're talking about the Amazon when they say Rio Negro. In the century up to 1750, 3 million Indians. While this figure may be exaggerated, there is no question but that some Portuguese possessed more than 1,000 American slaves each. 1,000 slaves each, American slaves, not Africans. The Bishop of Bahia in Brazil in 1827 noted that 20,000 Americans in his province were suited to all kinds of work and industry. Another speaker mentioned 200,000 who can immediately settle Brazil. In the middle of the 19th century, a British visitor to the Guyana-Suriname region noted how prevalent the Indian slave trade has been and how recently carried on even without our boundaries. It still prevails on the southern borders of our colony and the northern tributaries of the Amazon. He noted further that Makusi of the interior were especially victimized. The Brazilians, as well as the Caribs, Acahuayos, etc., have long been in the habit of enslaving them. Slavery also continued in other sections of Brazil. In 1741, some 8,000 Kai'apo people of Goiás were enslaved. 8,000 Kai'apo people of Goiás were enslaved. Large numbers of carijos, servants, were present in the South, sometimes classified as administered Indians, but in practice used in servile status. Okay? These are Indians, not Africans. In the Spanish Empire and the independent republics established therefrom, slavery or semi-slavery also continued from the late 17th through the 19th century, in spite of laws prohibiting such. Along the northern frontier of Mexico, slavery continued during the 1690s and persisted until the 1860s, primarily involving Apaches, Navajos, Pauitis, Javapais, and other border nations, whose resistance made them subject to being captured. Some natives from this region were shipped to the West Indies. Again, you saw all these tribes, right? Apaches, Navajos, Pauitis, Javapais. Some of these were shipped where? To the West Indies. Who's arriving at the West Indies? Not Africans. More American natives. While others, such as the Yaqui in the 1880s, were sold to Yucatan. The Yaqui ended up in the Yucatan, Mexico. After the abortive Tupac Amaru rebellion in Peru in 1781, yes, it was a guy named Tupac Amaru who led a rebellion in Peru in the 1780s. However, the Inca nobility suspected of disloyalty to Spain were executed, imprisoned, or shipped to exile in Spanish Sahara. They sent them to North Africa. What? Incas, Tupac Amaru's people, to the Spanish Sahara. Thus, some Americans reached till another part of Africa. You see all what's going on. It's in reverse. In the American South, European traders, mostly British colonists, operating out of Charlestown, South Carolina, engaged local and distant American Indian tribes to undertake slaving against their neighbors. You hear that, right? Who could be made to walk the ships that would carry them to Barbados, New York, Antigua, and other ports in the Atlantic world, where they would work as slaves. So to the West Indies, right? All right, we're going to read from this article in this journal. It's called Indian Slavery in Colonial Georgia by Rodney M. Bain. This is from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, Volume 79, Number 2, Summer of 1995, pages 418 to 424. All right. It is well known that slavery was prohibited in Georgia soon after its founding. Far less recognized is the fact that the prohibition applied only to black slaves, so-called black. A bylaw adopted by the trustees in 1733 theoretically prohibited Indian traders from using any Negro or other slave in the Indian country. But the 1735 law, which more unequivocally banned the importation and use of slaves, applied only to blacks, not to Indians. Indian slaves served in the colony from its founding, but have been generally ignored by most historians. Of course, slavery was not a new concept by the time the English colonized the coast of southeastern North America, nor had it been introduced by the Spanish who preceded them. Slavery had long been a way of life among the various Indian nations, but the practice was much expanded during the 17th and 18th centuries, when thousands of southeastern Indians were captured by warring tribes and marauding whites were sent into bondage farther north or in the West Indies, far removed from their own tribes. All right, now we're in this this article is called Slavery and Native Americans in British North America and the United States, 1600 to 1865 by Tony Saber. We're just going to go to this part right here, when the Europeans arrived, right? So it says here, once Europeans arrived as colonialists in North America, the nature of Indian slavery changed abruptly and dramatically. Indians found that British settlers, especially those in the southern colonies, eagerly purchased or captured Indians to use as forced labor in cultivating tobacco, rice, and indigo, all right? They didn't use Africans, they used Indians, all right? More and more Indians began selling war captives to whites rather than integrating them into their own societies, as they used to do before the Europeans arrived. And as the demand for labor in the West Indies became insatiable, whites began to actively enslave Indians for export to the so-called Sugar Islands, all right? That includes Jamaica, right? The resulting Indian slave trade devastated the southeastern Indian populations and transformed Native American tribal relations throughout the region. The English at Charlestown, the Spanish in Florida, and the French in Louisiana sought trading partners and allies among the Indians, offering trading goods such as metal knives and axes, firearms and ammunition, intoxicants and beads, and clothes and hats in exchange for furs, deerskins, and Indian slaves captured from other tribes. Unscrupulous traders, frontier settlers, and government officials encouraged Indians to make war on other tribes to reap the profits from the slaves captured in such raids, or to weaken the warring tribes. The breaking out of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701 gave Governor Moore, a chance to attack the Spanish Indians, capture and sell them under the excuse of the rules of war. Therefore, in 1702, he led a force of militia and Indians against St. Augustine, burned the city, and carried off as slaves whatever Indians he could obtain from the Spanish Indian villages along the way. A second attack on St. Augustine was made by Moore in 1704 with the purpose of destroying missions and carrying off slaves. An advance into the territories of the Appalachee resulted in the destruction of several missions and the capture of more than 1,000 Indians, some free, some slave. Nearly all the Appalachee were distributed as slaves among the Carolina settlers. Alright? Now see who they're putting in these plantations, right? The Carolinas. Alright? The enslavement of Indians indeed was carried on wholesale. A letter to the proprietors, July 10, 1708, states that the garrison of St. Augustine is by this war reduced to the bare walls, their cattle and Indians' towns, all consumed either by us in our invasion of that place or by our Indian subjects. They have driven the Floridians to the islands of the Cape, have brought in and sold many hundreds of them, and many now continue that trade, so that in some 5 years they'll reduce the barbarians to a fearless number. They're talking about American Indians. In 1708, Colonial Barnwell of South Carolina made an expedition to the Appalachian province of Florida. It is thought that this was the time when Captain Narim of South Carolina, with a party of Yamasee Indians, advanced to the vicinity of Lake Okeechobee and brought back a number of captive Indians as slaves. A similar expedition of Colonel Palmer in 1727 against the Yamasee resulted in the destruction of many Indian towns, the slaughter of many natives, and the carrying off of great numbers to Charleston as slaves. Alright, so we're at Charleston. We know Charleston was a big slave port, basically where a lot of the American Indians were sent out to other parts of the world. We're talking about including Europe and West Africa. Alright? As the result of the 3 expeditions sent by South Carolina from 1702 to 1708 against the Yamasee, Appalachee, and Timucua of northern Florida, They was carried back to Charleston for sale as slaves. Almost the entire population of 7 towns in all, some 1,400 persons. Alright? And they'll tell you when you try to look for a lot of these tribes, which I learned about recently, the Timucua, right? These are tribes they never teach you about, right? But yeah, they're like, oh, what happened? They disappeared, or they exterminated. But you see what happened, really. Alright? How many times did this happen, that they got invaded, and then there's 1,400 now, and then another 1,400, here and there. Eventually, they blend in with other tribes, or they become, servants in plantations. And that's what really happened. Those are your ancestors, so-called Negroes. The captives taken in 1715, when the Yamasee and Creek Indians made a foray upon the South Carolina frontier, were sold as slaves. Alright? Mr. Johnston, a South Carolina missionary of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts, in his letter to the Society, December 19, 1715, states, "It is certain many of the Jamusis and Creek Indians were against the war all along, but our military men were so bent upon revenge and so desirous to enrich themselves by making all the Indians slaves that fall into your hands, that it is in vain to represent the cruelty and injustice of such a procedure." Again, what I just read was from the book. I just wanted to pause it real quick. So I just want to say, respect and much love to everybody in the chat. Thanks for being here. Just want to remind everybody we're here to build. I'm just reading information. It's not like I know all this stuff. All knowing is I'm just trying to put information together, have some resources for you guys, so you can come back and reference, and maybe help out in your story, your personal journey. And also, we Indians, so, we always had tribal warfare. We're passionate about this, and I know sometimes, it gets heated, but let's just try to build, and, let's just, think about what we want, for our future, for our, seeds, for our family. What do we want? Let's stop all the fuss and fighting, and just wanted to say that because we're going to read, we're going to continue to read. Yesterday we went over so much, slavery. I mean, this is hours and hours and hours of records. I hope you notice, and try to find at least one or two from Africa coming over here directly. Like, again, show me the slave ship, show me the voyage, the date, who's the captain, what tribe was taken, show me their history, their local history, to see if they have the same story, if it matches. And they don't, not like how we're matching it over here. And that's what I'm trying to show you guys. This is big. I'm trying to show you this happened in reverse. All right, and we're gonna get to what happened after. They did their encomienda system and started putting you as servants and under Christianity and all that. Book, The Native Races of the Pacific States of North America by Hubert Howie Bancroft. This is volume 1. He has like 5 volumes of this, and then like another series of the native races titled Native Races, and that's like another 5-6 volumes. So very good book. Let's go ahead and look inside. The Mexicans he considers as cognate with the Malays. Alright, so when he says Malays, what is he talking about? Because we got to understand that the original Malays, this is kind of what they look like. Alright, so he's comparing the Mexican as cognate with the Malays, he says. Continuing, Humboldt characterizes the nations of America as one race by their straight glossy hair, thin beard, swarthy complexion, and cranial formation. Again, if we remember from video 1, swarthy means black, especially when you're talking about skin. Swartz or Schwartz, swarthy. Morton, in his conference, the originators of the American homogeneity theory, even goes so far as to claim for the American man as origin as indigenous as that of the fauna and flora. All right, so they're saying that, the Native Americans are very, very ancient. They go back even to when they're fauna and flora, right? The species that were aboriginal to the land as well. They go that far back with the species, the plant life and the animals. They classify all the tribes of America, exceeding only the Eskimos who wandered over from Asia as the American race and divided into the American family and the Toltecan family. Toltecan. So again, I just want to emphasize what they just said. It says they classify all the tribes of America, excepting only the Eskimos, who wandered over from Asia, and that's what we've been trying to explain to everybody. That's most of the so-called Native Americans of today in the reservations are these Asians he is talking about that crossed over. Some ethnologists see in the Californians a stock different from that of any other American. Dwell upon the subject, the more convinced I am that, except in the broader distinctions, specific classifications of humanity are but idle speculations. Their height rarely exceeds 5 feet 8 inches and is more frequently 5 feet 4 or 5 inches, and although strongly they are seldom symmetrically built, a low retreating forehead, black, deep-set eyes, thick, bushy eyebrows, salient cheekbones, a nose depressed at the root, and somewhat wide, spreading at the nostrils, a large mouth with thick, prominent lips, teeth large and white, but not always regular, and rather large ears is the prevailing type. And who did that just describe? Their complexion is much darker than that of the tribes farther north, much darker, often being nearly black or black, so-called black, right? Copper colored. So that with their matted, bushy hair, so these sources, it says at Bodega Bay, they are ugly and brutish race, many with Negro profiles. This is ID page 103. They are physically an inferior race and have flat, unmeaning features, long, coarse, straight black hair, big mouths, and very dark skins. Revere's Tour, page 120. Large and strong, their color being the same as that of the whole territory. Morrill's Journal, page 47. It is said of the natives of the Sacramento Valley that their growth is short and stunted. They have short, thick necks and clumsy heads. The forehead is low, the nose flat with broad nostrils, the eyes very narrow and showing no intelligence, according to them, right? The cheekbones prominent and the mouth large. The teeth are white, but they do not stand in even rows, and their heads are covered by short, thick, rough hair. Who is that? Their color is dirty, yellowish brown. That's their best description. Dirty, yellowish brown, in their racist views. Pfeiffer's Second Journal, page 307. This race of Indians is probably inferior to all others on the continent. Many of them are diminutive in stature, but they do not lack muscular strength, and we saw some who were tall and well formed. Their complexion is dark mahogany. Again, dark mahogany, or often nearly black. Their face is round or square, with features approximating nearer to the African than the Indian. All right? This is in a historical, anthropological account book from this scholar. All right? And he's actually using other sources here, not just his source. 8. The mouth is very large, and the nose broad and depressed, chiefly distinguished by their dark color. All right, they're chiefly distinguished by their dark color. Broad faces, a low forehead. Haley, Ethnologies, volume 6, page 222, says their features are coarse, broad and of a dark chocolate color. Dark chocolate color. How more specific can that be? Taylor in California Farmer says November 2nd, 1860. Ugly, stupid, and savage. Otherwise, they are well formed, tolerably tall, and of a dark brown complexion. So even though he's pointing out his racist views, right, he's being completely honest. You can see he's saying ugly, stupid, and savage, right? That's what he thinks, honestly, of them. But he's also letting us know, honestly, that they are of a dark brown complexion. The women, he continues, are short and very ugly. They have much of the Negro in their countenance. All right, so this guy's a very honest guy. And now he's saying the women have much of the Negro in their countenance. Come on, let's wake up. They all have very savage look and are of a very dark color. Again, very dark color, all of them. Chimizo in Kosebew's Voyage, Volume 3, page 47. At Santa Clara, they are of a blackish color. Again, in Santa Clara, they're of blackish color. They have flat faces, thick lips, and black, coarse, straight hair. Kosebew's New Voyage, Volume 2, page 98. At Placerville, they are most repulsive-looking wretches. They are nearly black, and are exceedingly ugly according to his racist views. Borthwick's 3 years in, is that Khalifa or California, page 128. In the Yosemite Valley, they are very dark colored. In Yosemite Valley, Yosemite National Park, they are very dark colored. The aboriginals from there, and the women are perfectly hideous, according to Neelan's book. And continuing even more correlation, it says here, at San Jose, the men are almost all rather above the middling stature and well built. Very few indeed are what may be called undersized. Their complexions are dark but not Negro-like. Some seem to possess great muscular strength. They have very coarse black hair, coarse. Some of the women were more than 5 feet 6 inches in height. And speaking of the Californian Indians in general, they are of a middling or rather of a low stature and of a dark brown color, approaching to black. What does all this mean? Large projecting lips and broad, flat, Negro-like noses. Again, large projecting lips and broad, flat, Negro-like noses. Who are they describing? They're describing you. Very strong resemblance to the Negroes. A very strong resemblance. It is so-called Negroes. And in the bottom it says, low foreheads and skins, as black as Guinea Negroes. As black as Guinea Negroes. And just a few more sources. It says here, skin of such a deep reddish brown, that it seems almost black. It seems almost black to them because it's a deep reddish brown. They have no words for it, right? Figures human race, page 493. That's where you can find that. Bushmen's spewing their Aztec. They're talking about the Aztecs. Page 528. Forbes of California, page 180. All right. Harper's Monthly, volume 13, page 583. All those books say the same thing. A deep reddish brown that seems almost black. All right. Now let's go to this. All right. So yeah, who would they describing right there? That book is actually filled with pages like that. From Howard Bancroft. If you don't know who Howard Bancroft is, research him. You've heard of Bancroft Library. If you haven't, he bought so many books, these historical accounts and stuff. He has a collection. He has a famous collection. So he made his own books based on all the information he had, compiled. And his book is filled with nothing but primary sources. All right. So you heard what I was just reading out loud was the sources actually he was quoting. All right. So we're gonna get into this. I showed this in I believe in my first part of my video. This was some bones they had found. It's interesting because every time I read now, this was just one example. This was last year, but as I keep reading, they keep finding so-called Negro bones in Indian burials, Indian caves, or Indian settlements. All right, they keep finding them all over in the Caribbean. All right, but they keep trying to say it was slavery intrusion. All right, but this article is going to let us know this was pre-Columbian. This was pre-Columbian. All right. Journal is from an anthropological science magazine journal. This came out in 1939. Volume 38 actually spoke of the same thing. It was like the beginning of the talk, and the next month for volume 39, they continue to talk about it. So it says here, see if I can zoom into it. So again, it's Man, a monthly record of anthropological science, published under the direction of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. It says here, Negro skeletal remains from Indian sites in the West Indies. It says the recent paper in this journal by Buxton, Trevor, and Julian, they're talking about the previous article I mentioned, right? Volume 47, 1938, implies that an undeformed Negroid physical type inhabited the Virgin Islands in pre-Columbian times. Not only is this implication contrary to previously accepted findings for the Antillean area, as will be shown later, but it also fails to give adequate consideration to the possibility of these skeletal remains representing intrusive Negro burials. The mere presence of skeletons in a sand or shell mound of Indian origin, like in careful stratigraphic records, is not certain evidence of primary association with the accompanying artifacts. All right, so so you find so-called Negro skeletons in Indian shelled mounds. And this was one case, but it's all over the Caribbean. I venture to say that few physical anthropologists familiar with American Indian skulls would mistake for Indians those illustrated by Buxton, Trevor, and Julian. Indeed, most physical anthropologists would probably be less conservative and say Negro instead of Negroid. All right, so 100% Negro. He wouldn't even write or Negroid. It's a Negro or copper-colored person, right? In support of the opinion that these authors are describing Negroes, one, I wish to present a similar case from Barbados, British West Indies. From correspondence with Mr. E.M. Shilstone of Bridgetown, Barbados, it appears that in August 1933, he commenced to excavate a sandy ridge about 50 yards from high water mark on the shore of Chancery Lane on the southern coast of the island. The ridge proved to be a kitchen, midden containing many objects of Arawak workmanship. Among other things encountered in the site was a skeleton, lying on its left side at about 20 inches under the surface. Mr. Shilstone believed this skeleton to be that of an Arawak Indian, and in 1937 presented it as such to the U.S. National Museum. Production of the skull from the many fragments in which it was received in Washington, I felt justified in calling it a Negro for reasons that will appear from the following description. Two views of the Barbados skulls are shown in Play D1 and 2. Comparison with the two skulls shown in the paper by Buxton, Trevor, and Julian indicates that the individual and sex differences are no more than would be expected of the range of variation in a single race. Certainly, however, such Negroid features as alveolar prognatism, broad nose, and low orbits are more pronounced in the case of the skulls. So as you can see, this information here correlating more findings of skulls. So it's not just in one location, right? So far we got a couple of different sources, right? So this is actually from the volume number 38 before the one we just read, when they were just learning that it's starting to look like Negroid, they're saying. So right here they're still arguing. Let me just show you. It says, Professor Hatt over the face seemed to argue against the likelihood of secondary interment after the introduction of Negro slaves in the 17th century, while admitting that the conditions declined provisionally to accept a pre-Columbian date for the remains as a whole. They're saying pre-Columbian, before Columbus, so it's not introduced and it wasn't a mixture of African slaves. Now, let's read on. So it's interesting. It says, it is perhaps not without significance that Sir William Flower, 1895, commented on the Negroid characteristics of 2 out of a number of Jamaican crania of undoubted Indian origin examined by him. This series was subsequently measured by Dr. Haddon, who mentions the occurrence of considerable variation in the values of the nasal indices in his note on the craniology of the Aborigines of Jamaica, during 1897. Additional human material from the Virgin Islands may elucidate the problem arising from the present discussion. So it's becoming a problem to them because they're finding all these Negroid skeletons, right, pre-Columbian, all over the places, right? So that book from Jamaica, or that reference, you can find it here if you see it. It says Durden J.E. 1897, Aboriginal Indian remains in Jamaica. And Flower Sir William 1895 on the recent discovered remains of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Jamaica. Alright, it says leading the father, the Pawnee homeland, couriers the boys in the Villas Shore expedition of 1720 by Christopher Steinke, University of New Mexico. Alright, so we're going to get into this part. I talked about a little bit of the French enslavement, their involvement, and especially these dudes, the courier de boys. It's a crazy phrase because courier of boys, like, what do you mean you're carrying boys? Is that literal or the boys? You know, what are they trying to say? I don't know. But I'm letting you know these guys were not just fur traders. These were some very professional, actually, slavers. All right, they were hustlers. The company preoccupation with the slave trade raises questions about its size and relative importance in the 18th century Great Plains. All right, who are these couriers de boys? How big are they? How important were they in the 18th century in the Great Plains in this slave trade? Markets in Louisiana and New Mexico created a demand for slaves that plain Indians were attempting to satisfy as early as 1706. When Ulubari noted that Apaches and Pawnees were raiding each other to sell captives to the Spaniards and French, respectively, among Indian nations in the eastern plains, only the powerful Osages seemed immune from the retaliatory cycles of slave raiding. Practically no Osage captives appeared in French settlements in the Illinois country. Pawnees were less fortunate. Osages seized so many Pawnee in Wichita captives that they may have adopted a matrilocal household organization from their Caddoan enemies. And traders delivered enough Pawnee slaves to French markets in the Illinois country. Traders. Slave traders. The Pays d'Anhot in Canada, that Pawnees became the French term for any Indian slave originating from the west of the Mississippi. You hear that? It was a general adjective or description, right? It wasn't a certain tribe. Like, eventually it became a term for any Indian slave originating from west of the Mississippi, Pawnees. Although many of these slaves were not in fact... I'm sorry, I was muted. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that part that was just talking about the Pawnees. Right? So that term basically just, meant, that you were coming from the western side, an Indian coming from the western side that was, put in captivity or a prisoner. And so you could have been Cheyenne, Sioux, Apache, but, once you got in their hands, they were just calling you Pawnees, all right? So, because you were originating from the west of the Mississippi. All right, Pawnees, but Indians from neighboring tribes. About 68% of the Indian slaves in French Canada who received Indian names in the documentation, over 2,000 appear as Pawnees. All right, but they were from other tribes. Again, all these slaves, they're not African. The French are enslaving your ancestors. Until well into the latter half of the 18th century, Indian slaves were held by the settlers of Detroit, who obtained them in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. All right, Indian slaves were held in Detroit. What's Detroit today? What's it full of? These were not Africans. You are not African. You see the real history right? It was Indian slaves. These were not African people. You are not a descendant of African. If you're in the Detroit area, if you can trace it back hundreds of years, it was Indian slaves that were being held by the early settlers, all right, who obtained them again in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. In 1741, the so-called Nation of the Serpent entirely destroyed 17 villages, killed all the men and older women, made slaves of the young women, and traded them for horses and other merchandise. A report to the home government in 1720 concerning CHOPPAZ declared that the most extensive commerce which could be carried on with the Indians of that section would be in slaves, horses, skins, etc. Okay, so again, the French were here mainly for trade, and their venture was mainly commercial purposes, and the primary thing helping this was slaves, American Indian slavery, workforce, free labor. Another report sent by Lassalle told of the Alabama Indians bringing 27 or 28 mobile Indian women and children into the colony and disposing of them to the French. All right, so, it's unfortunate to hear how, the ancestors were enslaving each other. A lot of the times, there was past wars, of course, between them, but also just for survival. They wanted, their tribe to survive, and, so that was the only way, really, that, the few can really conquer the mass, right? We helped, they had help, and still today, they're getting help. The friendly and allied Indians appreciated the results to be obtained from the sale of their captives to the whites, and not only sold them to the couriers, the boers, and other traveling traders, but took them directly to the French settlement for sale, as is shown in the preceding paragraph. So can you imagine in these times, this was a big hustle. Like, think about it, man. All right, so you got, I'm like, really think about it, right? So you got these American Indians, right, so-called Negroes, right, with their fur coats on, because they were doing fur trade, right? They're chilling. They got money. They're in the trade business, and they're over here selling people, your own people. All right, it's unfortunate again that this happened, but we, what can we learn from this? All right, can we unite now? Right? Apparently, all the leading French settlements afforded a ready market for such slaves. Again, apparently, all the leading French settlements, all right, afforded a ready market for such slaves. All these French colonies, settlements in America were basically taking in American Indian slaves. Mostly not Africans. Show us the African records. Alright, there is a real history being told here and recorded. Mobile furnishes a case in point. On November 1706, a party of Wakanda arrived in the settlement, bringing some Abenaki captives for sale. In the same month, also some Choctaw brought to the settlement Kawita and Altamaha captives for the same purpose. All right, so everybody was in the game. That was the game at the time. Everybody, whether it was for survival or whatever, but a lot of the tribes were doing it to each other. All right. And it's interesting, this tribal name Kawita, because we got a town in our indigenous region called Talamanca, Costa Rica, called Kawita. An important factor in the French colonial trade was the coureurs de bois. These men, having cut loose from civilization, wandered at will among the Indians, trading for the various commodities which they could dispose of in the settlements of either the French or English colonies. All right, so they say trade. We gotta have the open quotes, close quotes, trade. Right, they were basically slavers. Most of them. That was the real hustle. That was the real, like, and today, that would be the money. All right. One of these commodities was Indian slaves. Okay. One of these commodities is the major commodity. You are the gold, obtained for the most part from the tribes who had captured them in war. Judging from the number of these white men of the woods, their unrestrained life, and the evidence given by the men of the time, it seems not unlikely that this feature of colonial trade produced a considerable portion of Indian slaves used by the French. If the coureurs de bois did not find a sufficient number of slaves among the tribes they visited, they not infrequently stirred up the tribes to war, so that they might obtain the captives for sale. You see what they were doing? So there was a group of people. Their main job was to go get slaves, and when they couldn't find any, they, or if anybody was in war, they would create wars. All right, they would create the problem, then they would bring their solution, which was to enslave you. All right, you, not Africans, you. On July 25th, 1707, LaSalle wrote from Fort Louis to the Minister of Marine that the coureurs de bois from Canada were thus stirring up the Indian tribes against each other in order to obtain Indian slaves to sell in Louisiana. The work of the coureurs de bois was, however, by no means limited to Louisiana, but extended over all the area claimed by the French. So they're saying coureurs de bois. Now, how many people is this? Who were they? This is a really, this is a really general description of obviously more than one person. We're talking about a large group of people doing this all over the area claimed by the French, which was pretty huge. We know that, right? The desire of the English for Indian slaves afforded an opportunity for profit that could not be rejected. All right, so English plantations, right? And they were getting them from these coureurs de bois. This is really general. Europeans and also other American Indian traders, right? Again, none of these were African. They always found a ready market for their Indian slaves with the English of the Carolina country. The control of the French officials over this wandering class was always slight, and since there was practically no export trade in Indians to be had in Louisiana, and since all the Indians whom they obtained could not be disposed of in the colony, they turned to the English colonies for the purpose. The English what? Plantation. They definitely needed slaves in these plantations, right? Right? Cotton, sugar plantations. We know the stories, right? Of slavery. Where were they getting their supply? Their workforce? From American Indian slaves. Alright? Let's wake up. Some effort was made by the French officials to prevent this trade, but the attempt met with indifferent success. They didn't stop this. It was a successful business, commerce going on, enslaving your ancestors to the plantations. It was not the traffic in human beings which disturbed them, but the fact that their enemy, the English, were profiting by transaction. So they didn't care about you getting enslaved because they were doing it. They were taking advantage of that. They just cared that their rivals, the English, wouldn't get, too powerful in that region, have too much success. That's what they were worried about. They didn't care about you. In 1714, a report of Cadillac to the home government lamented both his inability to restrain the French allied Indians from trading with the English in slaves and other commodities, and also his embarrassment at not being able to prevent the French colonists from trading with the English in skins and Indian slaves. The slave trade had evidently become enough of a problem in the plains by the late 1710s that French officials identified it as their primary obstacle to commercial and political expansion. In 1717, François de Lemarie, a priest who had served for nearly a decade in the settlement of Mobile, composed a memoir on Louisiana in which he recommended that the French crown outlaw the Indian slave trade in the Great Plains. It was so major, it was affecting so much what was going on, right? They wanted to control it, really. That's what they really wanted to do, right? So they wanted to outlaw it supposedly because it was so major, right? Indian slave trade this is not Africans. Again, Indian slave trade. He specifically condemned those coureurs de bois, the coureurs de bois, like Poudret, who bought and sold slaves of Paducas and other peoples of the Missouri. A ban on the slave trade would, he concluded, cut at the root the wars that the Indians only continue between themselves because of the advantageous sale that they make of their captives to the traders, who then resell them in this colony to the Spanish and to the vessels that come to our port for selling them a third time to the islands. All right, who were they giving the Spanish, and who was going to these islands in the West Indies? American Indians, not Africans. All right, there was a whole circle of slave trade, right? We're starting to see, right? Is it starting to add up to you? The directors of the Compagnie des Indes, monitoring their unprofitable colony from Paris and hoping to open the New Mexico trade through the Paducas, eventually heeded Le Marier's call for a ban on the slave trade. All right, so remember in the other book we read the ban, right? But it didn't have no effect, really. Let's see what it says here. In late October 1720, they ordered Governor Bienville to end the Indian slave trade. Bienville, right? We got him on the other book, right? Along the Missouri and Arkansas rivers because the raiding for captives inhibited trade across the plains. They complained that voyagers were fomenting war between Indian nations in order to procure slaves. All right? They were instigating wars. This was not only contrary to the orders of the king, but very harmful to the well-being of the company's commerce. While the director of the Compagnie des Indes believed that an end to the slave trade would secure peace in the plains, they overestimated the influence of slave trading coureurs de bois. They overestimated the influence of slave trading coureurs de bois on Pawnee chiefs. Accordingly, in 1693, they petitioned the governor of Canada to prohibit the trade in Indian slaves. The request was granted in an order issued to that effect, but without definite result. The coureurs de bois continued the trade in spite of the penalty of fine and imprisonment. It didn't do anything to change the outcome. The American Indian slavery continued hundreds of years. It has already been seen that the French missionaries of early colonial days believed that the enslavement of Indians would serve as means of spreading the Christian religion. They found, however, that the method of obtaining Indian slaves by trade only increased the distribution of spirituous liquors among the tribes. And so in 1693, they asked the king to prohibit the Indian slave trade. An order to this effect was accordingly issued, but with little result. The coureurs de bois found means to carry on the trade. It says here, to open up and work the mineral resources of Louisiana, Philip Francois Renaud was sent out by the Company of the West in 1719. On his way, he bought at San Domingo, or we're talking about Santo Domingo, right, in Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, in the name of his company, 500 Negroes for work in the mines. So he went to Santo Domingo, right? He didn't go to Africa. He went to Santo Domingo, he captured, and he bought, 500 Negroes, not Africans, people of dark-skinned complexion. We already know what that is, right? Other American Indians. Dash the hijack. For work, so very important. So if they got this successful slave trade from Africa, why didn't this guy just go where they normally go and get their slaves? Well, actually, he did. He did go where they normally go to get slaves. And one of the sources was Hispaniola, right, as you see here. Working on these mines, where? In Louisiana. So these were not Africans coming in there. These Negroes were taken into the Illinois country.
The trade in slaves proved to be so profitable that Carolina's English and Scottish slavers and their Indian allies pushed themselves deep into Spanish and French territories to hunt for captives. The trade in Indian slaves was a vast enterprise that stretched from as far west as Spanish New Mexico to as far north as the Great Lakes. Virtually every tribe living in this large area was involved in this commerce either as a supplier of captives or as middlemen.
The Caddo traded Lipan Apache, but the Caddo don't really seem to keep slaves. They just kind of trade us down the line trade, so to speak. After that, where you have the first count of slaves is more people like from lower Louisiana, the Washoe, the Chawashaw, the Chitamacha, people like that go into Mobile. By the time they're settled up here and the system is well entrenched in the French trading system, the primary source of slaves is coming from the West.
Many indigenous nations suffered due to enslavement. On the Atlantic seaboard, entire tribes were sold into slavery to the Caribbean.
A compelling example of Indians being sold into slavery in Virginia that's often overlooked is what happened to the Nanzatico people in 1704. That's actually the one instance that we have where a tribe was essentially eliminated as a result of a conflict here. And a small party of those Nanzatico Indians committed a killing of one family, the John Rowley family. But what happened as a result, the Nanzatico were impugned to give up the killers, and they did that. And the killers were convicted in English court, and they were hanged. But the General Assembly also decided that the entire nation could be retaliated against because of what these men had done. So they actually passed a ruling that enslaved the entire population of the Nanzatico, with the exception of children that were under 12, and all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua in the West Indies.
Oh, I thought they were Africans.
Other than being a convenient source of free labor, the enslavement and deportation of Indians to the Caribbean was part of a systematic plan to eliminate the native presence from the emerging colonies.
On August 28, 1676, I just wanted to pause it and just do a little reflection here. So I just want to mention something that they've been talking about and showing here is you know, the involvement of our ancestors helping all these traders and colonists and slavers out. And as you can see, it was a big hustle. All right. And yeah, you know, we're known to hustle. So, you know, would we do that today? Would we sell our own people for the hustle, just for the hustle? I mean, is crack being sold in the hood still? All right. So I want you to think about that. And you know, everybody got to do what they have to do. But, you know, it's time to rise, and it's time to rise up your own people. Don't put your own people down. All right? Stop looking for the negative in your brother. Try to look at the positive. Try to help him out, reach that positiveness. All right? 6. Also, the governor of Plymouth wrote to the governor of Rhode Island that Captain Church had been chosen and authorized by Plymouth to demand and receive of the governor of Rhode Island all the captive Indians, and to guard and conduct them to Plymouth, or to sell and dispose of them as he chose, to the inhabitants or others for terms of life, or for shorter terms, as there may be reasons. No exception to this custom of enslavement was made in the case of the praying Indians. During the course of the war, several of these Indians, through the harsh dealings of the English, and because of neglect to provide them with sufficient shelter, protection, and encouragement, joined the warring Indians. Such of these Indians as were taken in arms were declared by the Massachusetts General Court to be in rebellion and were tried and sentenced, some to be killed, but the most of them to be transported and sold as slaves. Hear that? In an attack on an Indian fort in 1711, 39 women and children were captured and disposed of in the settlements as slaves. The two chief expeditions during the war were those of Colonel Barnwell, who was sent by South Carolina in January 1712, and of Colonel Moore in January and February of 1713. Colonel Barnwell expedition took 200 Indian women and children prisoners. The expedition of Colonel Moore virtually ended the war by capturing the fort in which the Tuscarora had taken refuge. 900 men, women, and children were killed or taken prisoners. And that's, again, what we really are, prisoners of war, POWs, not descendants of slaves. In both expeditions, the Allied Indians secured as many as possible of the captured Indians whom they took along with them to sell as slaves in Charleston. And they still further increased their supply of slaves by attacking the peaceful Indians along the route of their return to South Carolina. During the course of the war, more than 700 Indians were sold into slavery. I just want to pause it right there. And nowhere in my teachings, we say that you actually started out as a slave. In fact, I teach otherwise, or I show otherwise, actually, and other brothers show otherwise. And what I'm trying to show here is the real so-called slave trade. All right, we're going to get to if these were really slaves. All right, we're going to get to that. Talking about servitude and indentured servant. And if you have the time, tonight you're going to hear all about that. And yes, so I get to know people, get to know the info, the background, so you can see where we're coming from. Definitely, this ain't anything about ADOS, nothing like that. Prisoners of war, all right? There was a Papa Bull made out. There was the doctrine of discovery and all that, manifest destiny. They plant all this. All right, so yeah, you didn't start out as a slave, but you became a prisoner of war. You still are. You're still in indentured servitude. All right. All right. You see number 9 there, footnote. You want to go read it? It says Bassett, John Hopkins University Studies. All right, page 73. Go read it if you want. All right, we're in the encyclopediavirginia.org website. It says here, Indian enslavement in Virginia. Indians were enslaved in Virginia by settlers and traders from shortly after the founding of Jamestown until the end of the 18th century, peaking late in the 17th century and providing a workforce for English plantations and households. By this time, the Atlantic slave trade was at its peak. Watch the hijack, all right? Other American Indians flooding Virginia with cheaper African labor. African slavery took nearly a century to develop. It took almost 100 years to develop. However, and in the meantime, while that was supposedly developing, those white Virginians who required men and women to work as servants or in tobacco fields mostly relied on indentured servants and enslaved Indians. Indentured servants. Europeans sold guns for slaves in an existing indigenous trading market and encouraged allied tribes to provide the slaves by targeting Indian groups on the periphery of English settlements, similar to African participation in the capture of slaves in Africa. Touch your own hijack. While there are some examples of continued enslavement of Indians throughout the early settlement period, mass enslavement typically coincided with the upheaval of war that led to Indian prisoners who could be sold as slaves, POWs. Virginia's laws were neither clear nor effective with respect to the enslavement of Indians, at times banning the practice and at other times encouraging it. Some scholars argued that Indian enslavement had declined by 1800 because Indians were prone to illness or escape, but others maintained that it was only when Indians, racked by war and enslavement, could not provide sufficient quantity of cheap workers that English colonists, turned primarily to chattel African slavery, the hijack other American so-called Negroes, Indians, indigenous people that were being brought up. American Indians were most clearly deemed free by Virginia law early in the 1800s, and Indians who were unable to gain their freedom often became assimilated within the predominantly African slave communities. They came what? The Indians became who? African American? The South Carolinians used some of these slaves to work their own plantations, but because of the ability of captives to escape over familiar territory among familiar peoples, their captors preferred to export most of them elsewhere. Capital from selling Indian slaves was used to fund plantations and purchase so-called Africans, the hijack. It was as if one could create capital out of thin air. The only effort lay in capturing the prey and transporting it to the market. Native peoples engaged in slaving for a variety of reasons. In exchange for captives, they received European trade goods. Many also hoped for forged closer relationships with the British. To refuse to become slave raiders, they risked becoming categorized as potential victims, with their enemies then filling the role of slavers. The result, a frenzy of slaving infected the region, as natives captured not only their enemies, but people they had never met. Some went farther and captured their friends and allies. Small-scale raids with attacks on fewer than a dozen people evolved into large-scale wars, with the British and the American Indian allies seeking captives in the thousands. Extending southward from Charleston, British and native raiders followed attacks upon the native peoples of Georgia with a massive onslaught against Indians on Spanish missions in northern Florida. Systematically, the raiders extended all the way to the Florida Keys. Simultaneously, the English established important ties with the Chickasaw, who became the key slavers of the lower Mississippi Valley, the Chickasaw, extending their attacks west of the Mississippi and south to the Gulf of Mexico. The Chickasaw, surrounded by enemies on all sides, used slaving as a way to strengthen themselves at their enemies' expense. But great losses in slave and wars weakened them immensely. The numbers are difficult to calculate, but I estimate that 30,000 to 50,000, perhaps more, American Indians were exported from Charlestown. Thousands more were exported from ports like Boston and Salem, and on a much smaller scale by the French from New Orleans. Untold numbers which scholars are just beginning to calculate. You hear that, right? Will ultimately include the thousands who were not exported from their region but lived out their lives as slaves on the plantations in Virginia. We're talking about American Indians in this article. Remember that. We're talking about that you were never imported or you were never exported. You were enslaved in your own land, and thousands of you were not counted, living out your rest of your lives as slaves in these plantations, from as an Indian enslaved, and then you lived out your life as a so-called Negro. And the records, colored in the records, as time went on, you were remembered as an African that was brought in when you were always there. You were from there. It's telling you right now, and this article is telling you, thousands were not exported from their region but lived out their lives as slaves on plantations in Virginia, as farm laborers in Connecticut, and domestics in New France. Although the scale of enslavement pales in comparison to African slave trade, touch your own hijack. It is notable, for instance, that from 1670 to 1717, far more American Indians were exported from Charlestown than Africans were brought in. Again, more American Indians from 1670 to 1717 were exported from Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were brought in. Does that make sense to you? Scholars long have known about the Indian slave trade, but the scattered nature of the sources deterred a systematic examination. No one had any conception of the trade's massive extent, and that it played such a central role in the lives of early Americans and in the colonial economy. The earliest of the slave-producing wars in New England was that with the Pequot in 1637. The war consisted of two battles, the Mystic Fight and the Swamp Fight. In the first, these two events, but 7 captives were taken. In the second, the Swamp Fight, about 180 captives were taken. 2 of the Sakem, taken in the Swamp Fight were spared, on promise that they guide the English to the retreat of Sasakus. The other men captives, some 20 or 30 in number, were put to death. The remaining captives consisted of about 80 women and children. So they kept the women and children, were divided. Some were given to the soldiers, whether gratis or for pay does not appear. 30 were given to the Narragansett, who were allies with the English. 48 were sent to Massachusetts, and the remainder were assigned to Connecticut. The women and girls of the Massachusetts captives were distributed among the towns. It seems probable that Connecticut made a similar disposition of its share of the captives regardless of sex. The male children among the Massachusetts captives were ordered by the Massachusetts General Court in 1637 to be carried to the Bermudas by William Pierce and sold there as slaves. Indian children, not Africans, were sent, right, to the Bermudas, right, and they were sold there as slaves. The shipload of Indians, however, consisting of 15 boys and 2 women, was taken by Captain Pierce to the West Indies instead of to the Bermudas, and disposed of at the island of Providence. All right, big one right there. All right, so these Pequot, right, they were sent to Providence Island. This is off the coast of Honduras, Nicaragua, around there, in between from those countries in Jamaica, and a lot of those people ended up with the mosquitoes, or mosquito people, and they're supposed to be Africans, but we know, if you saw part 3 of this, series, right, we know it was actually American Indians that they were taken there. And these same Pequot, they were called cannibal Negroes. They were calling them in another book. We can show you that. Cannibal Negroes. Alright, so one Pequot seized near Block Island was sent to England. It is possible that this single cargo of women and children was not the only one sent to the islands at this time. A letter from the Company of Providence Islands, replying from London July 3rd, 1638, to letters from authorities on the island and directing that special care be taken of the cannibal Negroes brought from New England. What did I just tell you? And I didn't know this was on this book too. Alright? But I just told you, and I was going to show you the actual book this is written, this is quoted from. I have it. But you can see it right now. I ain't going nowhere. Alright, so it says, again, this letter said, you need to take special care of these cannibal Negroes brought from New England. They're talking about Pequot in American Indians, because there were so much rebels, right? They were like rebelling and kicking their ass up there, So they said, take care of these special cannibal Negroes. They had to add the cannibal in there, right? And a second letter written in 1639, when the company, fearing that danger that might arise from too large a number of Negroes on the island, Negroes, all right? So we were talking about Indians, right? They have not mentioned bringing any Africans to these islands yet, right? So now all of a sudden, right? Let's go. What are they calling these cannibal Negroes or Pequots? They're calling them now Negroes, right? Now, the whole thing is Negroes now, because now they're in the West Indies, so nobody knows their history, right? So they are, dark skinned, so hey, Negroes, right? So again, fearing that the danger that might arise from too large a number of Negroes on the island, suggested that the Negroes be sold or sent to New England or Virginia. may possibly have been called forth by further purchase of Indians or by an exchange of Negroes for them. Using this definition, Resendez estimates the number of Indian slaves in the Americas at between 2.5 million and 5 million, fewer than the approximately 12.5 million Africans enslaved between the 15th century and the late 19th century. Dodge the hijack, dodge your own hijack. Prove these are Africans. From our studies, we're seeing that these are American Indians that are being brought up from different parts of America, not from Africa. But a staggering number nonetheless. Moreover, he argues, though, listen to this, that population loss due to enslavement was in fact much greater in the Americas than in Africa. It was much greater in the Americas due to enslavement. Population loss due to enslavement was larger, much greater in the Americas than in Africa. Much larger. All right? Population loss due to slavery. All right, if you go do research, all right, was greater in America than in Africa. All right, verify the info. When you say it's a lie, you got to prove it. This ain't one of those channels you could just blur out things. Like in all those other channels, everybody's just blurring out things and ain't proving or showing anything. You know, it's a bunch of ego talk and back and forth and debating, and nothing gets done, nothing gets learned, nothing gets taught. All right, let's go back. He's going to say it again. Slavery, not merely epidemic disease, was the primary cause of the high mortality rates of 70% to 90% that some Indian societies experience. In revealing the centrality of slavery to colonization, the other slavery amounts to a searing indictment of empire, starting with Christopher Columbus, who touted enslavement as a way of finance and empire. Successive waves of conquistadores and colonizers profited from the trade in humans. Some, including Columbus, exported Indians to the Old World, so-called Old World, in a reverse middle passage. Reverse middle passage. But the vast majority, again, reverse middle passage. Majority of the enslaved remained in the Americas. By the time of King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, the colonists were well accustomed to the sending of Indian captives out of the country and to the use of them in their homes. So, servants in their homes. The policy followed toward the Indians captured in this war was the same as that shown in the Pequot War. The captives were either exported for sale in the European or West Indian slave markets. Where? European. Indians being sent to Europe. European slave markets. We already got the accounts of the Spanish sending American Indians to Seville, Lisbon, the Portuguese, Cape Verde, West Africa, and from there going to Holland and other places, right? And other European countries. Now, again, in this book, I'm letting you know, the captives were either exported for sale in the European or West Indian slave markets, or were retained in servitude in the colonies. Servitude. Again, pay attention. Servitude. They're going to keep throwing it at you. In the beginning of the war, Captain Mosley captured 80 Indians who were retained at Plymouth. In the following September, 178 were put on board a vessel commanded by Captain Sprague, who sailed from Plymouth with them for Spain. All right? How many? 178 put on a ship, a vessel, right? What is a vessel in those times? We're talking about ships, right? We're not talking about spaceships or anything like that. Right? We're not talking about teleportation. We ain't talking planes. We're talking about ships, right? Deuteronomy 28. Yep. Right? Tell them again. Deuteronomy. Or am I making things up here? Nah, you're right. 178 were put on board a vessel commanded by Captain Sprague, who sailed from Plymouth, right? Massachusetts, right? With them for Spain. In this same year, 1675, Indians, probably from the coast of Maine, were landed as slaves at Fayal, one of the Azores. West Africa? Huh? Azores, we're talking about Cape Verde, Azores, Madeiras, Canary Islands. A lot of those people are American Indians. They were bringing you there by the thousands. I hope the numbers are adding up in these last few videos for you. This is just the books I've read out to you. There's more numbers in other books. Again, in 1675, 15 Indians were captured and sent to Boston, tied neck to neck like a galley slaves. Who? Indians sent to Boston, tied neck to neck like galley slaves. Much against the will of the populace, they were given a trial. All were finally acquitted. They were acquitted. So these so-called African slaves, right? Remember, they tell us, oh, African slaves suing and going to court. And no, they were never. They were free people. They were American Indians. And they were able to prove that. All were finally acquitted except 2 who were sentenced to be sold out of the country as slaves. Wow. During the years 1675 and 1676, one finds mention of the sale of Indians in Plymouth in groups of about 100. Groups of about 100. How many groups? They're not telling us, right? How many groups of about 100? 10 groups would be 1,000, right? All right. 57, 3, 160, 10, and 1. From June 25 to 1675 to September 23rd to 1676, the records show the sale by the Plymouth Colonial authorities of 188 Indians. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a similar disposal of captives was accomplished. On one occasion, about 200 were transported and sold. There is extant a paper written by Daniel Gooking in 1676, one item of which is as follows. And it says, a list of the Indians, children, that came in with John of Takakuhi. The list shows 21 boys and 11 girls distributed throughout the colony. With the close of the war after Philip's death, many of the Indian chiefs were executed at Boston and Plymouth, and most of the remaining chiefs with their captives followers were sold and shipped off as slaves outside the colonies. You see what they did, right? This is your ancestors, right? Where were they shipped off to? Could it one of those places be Cape Verde? And now listen, you're from Boston today, right? You're Cape Verdean, right? How do you know you're not American Indian? Why are there so many so-called Cape Verdeans in Boston, in New England? And why do they look like the tribes, the eastern tribes in those areas? Why do you guys look the same? Alright, go talk to each other. Those transported were carried to various parts. The Spanish West Indies, Spain, Portugal, Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores. Alright? See all the places where American Indians were sent to be servants or so-called slaves. Right? Spanish West Indies, right? The West Indies, Spain, right? Europe, Portugal. We're talking about Seville and Lisbon. These were huge slave markets, especially for American Indians. Bermuda, Virginia, and the Azores. The Indian slaves from Caribana. Trade and labor in the 17th century, Caribbean. So the 1600s, right? 1600s. Carolyn Mary Arena is the author, right? Submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Columbia University, 2017. All right, so now we're really in the introduction, I guess. So it says here, in 1668, a member of Charles II's Trade Council, and read up on that, the Trade Council, Benjamin Worsley, considered strategies for supplying plantation laborers for the English sugar colonies, particularly the new acquisition of Jamaica. So they had taken this from Spain. So they had made a whole plan right, to take over the wealth of the Spaniards in the West Indies. They wanted a cut in the trade, right? So-called trade. We're talking about the slave trade, plantation, encomiendas, repartimientos, right? So because they were growing and exporting it back to Europe, right? So they lost the battle in Hispaniola first, and then they went to Jamaica, and with little resistance took over the whole island, and that's how they gained Jamaica, the English. It says Worsley wrote that if the English Caribbean wanted to be sole masters of sugar for all the world, they could potentially use Guyana, the region of the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers, as a source for Indian slaves. Again, so these English were setting up shop, right? They had just acquired Jamaica. They're going to set up a sugar plantation, and they're already planning to get their slaves, not from Africa, right, but from the region on the north coast of South America between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers. This is in Guyana, as a source for Indian slaves, not Africans. He argued that it would take less time and thus be more profitable. Less time, right, than bringing people all the way from Africa, and thus be more profitable to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. More profitable, less time to transport slaves within the Caribbean region rather than from Africa. All right, again, it's more profitable to transport slaves within the Caribbean rather than from Africa. Now, if we are logical, right, why couldn't we think of that ourselves? Like, why do we have to read that in a report? Somebody that has a degree, right, telling us this thing, all right? You got a source, an abundance of slaves or servants or people you can put in servitude here. Why would you go all the way to the other side? Risk going on the voyage for like 2 or 3 months. You have to feed everybody, right? If you read the real accounts of these voyages, most of the time they barely made it. Every time they made it, it was like, they gave thanks, because they were like, it was like a miracle to them every time they crossed the Atlantic, right? I know you've seen my videos in the back, and the currents actually bring you over there. They don't bring you from over there. It's stronger. The currents actually bring you over there. It's 4 times harder to come back that way. Now, that's real science if you really want to do research. But, again, it was more profitable. All right, this is logical. Just do, 2 and 2 together. Very logical. Something we lost because we started depending on people thinking for us all these years. Let's break the spells. There, the English might take advantage of the continual wars and differences that the Indians of Guyana have one with another, just as slavers in Africa had benefited from internecine conflicts near the coast. Worsley noted that many slaves could be found upon the coast of Guyana, many slaves who ended up going to Jamaica, who today are called so-called Negroes and are considered to be descendants of African slaves. But in actuality, many of these so-called Jamaicans, right, come from an ancestry that came from Guyana, from Caribes. All right, we already got in part 3. We got Aztecs going to Jamaica, right? We know the English brought many American Indians over to Jamaica as well, to the sugar plantations. All right, and we got Caribana Indians there as well. We know Jamaica was a hub for where they sent many of the American Indians as slaves. They were growing the plantations there. That was a hub. And from there, they would take them and sell them other parts of Americas and even over to Europe. Yes, a slave port of American Indians. So what do you think that phrase means? Out of many one people, out of many tribes that were brought over there to work the sugar plantations. You became one people. Jamaica, Jamaica. Where the Indians do not only take one another prisoners, so they're taking advantage of the wars that were already there, the tribal wars between the peoples that was living in this region, and they would use one tribe against the other to get slaves, but do as usually sell one another for such goods as they lack in that country. Worsley had no direct experience in either the Caribbean or Africa, but he was a professional advisor. He knew what he was talking about, and his library inventory indicates that he had read multiple authors who referenced Indian slaves in the Caribbean. Multiple authors who had referenced Indian slaves in the Caribbean, including Walter Raleigh, we know that, Charles de Rochefort, through John Davis' English translation, and Richard Ligon. These sources were in no way advocating a regularized Indian slave trade. Indeed, although missionaries and humanists wrote about Indian slavery, and they abhorred precluding indigenous people from conversion to Christianity or subjecthood in the European monarchs or states through enslavement. Nevertheless, as this dissertation will highlight, each of these sources contain references to how Indian slaves contributed to the transformation of the Caribbean economy. So who had a strong influence in the transformation of the Caribbean economy? It was Indian slaves, and these sources contain many references of that. Just letting you know. Ad hoc purchases through captive markets and raids on indigenous communities during periods of war threatened Caribbean natives throughout the 17th century. Worsley's suggestion of a more institutionalized trade, which may have never been seriously considered, came to naught. However, his proposal reveals the importance of indigenous politics and trade on the Guyana coast and its impact on the successes and failures of colonial plantation economies. Indian slavery complicates the narrative we have created of a white-black world. Again, Indian slavery, because it was you, complicates the narrative we have created of a white-black world. Those are just tags. Of course, it's going to complicate those terms. With Indians residing outside on a vaguely defined frontier, the Indian slave trade connects natives and European history so that plantations and American Indian communities become entwined. We find planters making more money from slave trading than planting. Again, we find planters making more money from slave trading, and we're talking about slave trading Indians, your ancestors, than planting. And if we look more closely, we find Indians not only enslaved on plantations, but working as police forces to maintain those plantations and receiving substantial rewards for returning runaway slaves. We are also learning a great deal more about American Indian peoples. Most importantly, we can now tell the stories, the tragedies that befell so many who were killed in enslavement wars or spent their days as slaves far from their homes. They and their peoples have been largely forgotten. The Natchez, Westo, Yamasee, Yuchi, Yasu, and Tawasa are among the dozens of Indian peoples who fell victims to the slave and wars, with the survivors forced to join other native communities. These are tales that Indians themselves have not told. Just as the story of Indian slavery was excluded from the European past, it was largely forgotten in American Indian traditions. Americans often wish the past would just go away. Oh, it's in the past, forget about it. Neither Rhode Island nor Connecticut transported Indian slaves to the West Indies. Both colonies, however, retained Indian captives of King Philip's War, but only for limited periods of time, not for life. During the war, numerous bands of the Indians surrendered to the English at Providence and Newport. These and all other Indian prisoners held at the time were sold into service in the colony for a period of 9 years. The Indians thus sentenced did not become actual slaves, according to the strictest interpretation of the term. Alright, so again, the Indians thus sentenced did not become actual slaves according to the strictest interpretation of the term, since the persons who acquired them purchased only their services, alright, only their services for a stated period of time, and not for life. Alright, not for life. Their condition is better explained by the term involuntary indenture. Indenture. Alright, so we're going to start getting into this whole, that's the whole status thing of what you were called or what you were being tagged and labeled and classified, and you know what it meant to you as a person, if you were free, if you were an Indian, or if you were taxable, if you were a slave, right? And how this developed into chattel slavery, as you saw right here, if you read, that they were purchasing your services. So, like if you were a farmer, they purchased your services. If you were a cook, that's what they purchased, not your body or your person. That's different. That came much later. Much later. Alright? Indentured servants. Alright, we're in the National Archives website, Founders Online here. It says, to James Madison from William C.C. Claiborne, 21st of June, 1808. It says, sir, from the county of Opelousas, several Negroes have lately escaped the Spanish dominions, and several others who had designed to escape have been arrested. These events have excited much uneasiness among the farmers of the territory, and they await with impatience the interference of the general government. There has arisen another cause for anxiety among the holders of slaves. You are doubtless apprised that in the early settlement of Louisiana, Indians taken in war were permitted to be holden in slavery. And it is reported to me that in this territory there are now several hundred persons held as slaves, talking about Indians, who are descended of Indian families. Under the Spanish government and during the administration of Baron Carondelet, the auditor of the province had encouraged a claim set up by some of these unfortunate people to freedom. But it is understood that in consequence of the Baron's interference, the proceedings were stayed, and the question remained undecided. A lawyer a few months since brought a suit in the parish court of Opelousas against a citizen who held in slavery some Indian descendants. The assembly then in session took up the subject and passed a bill declaring that every Indian who was a slave before the taking possession of Louisiana by the Spanish government, and all other individuals of both sexes born from said Indians are and shall remain slaves. The bill was rejected by the executive upon the ground that it was worse than useless. If by the form and existing laws of the territory these people were legally held in slavery, the proposed measure was unnecessary. But if otherwise, no act of this government could reduce them to bondage, and an attempt to do so would be a reproach to the legislature. The suit above alluded to have been determined in favor of the plaintiffs, but the merits of the defendant's claim were not urged, these being reserved for the discussion before the Superior Court, to which I learned an appeal is to be made. The holders of these persons state that many years ago there were frequent wars among the several nations of Indians in the vicinity of Louisiana, and that they sold their prisoners as slaves with the assent of the colonial government to the French inhabitants. Resendes describes the boomtown mining centers of Mexico, notably Parral, which spurred a trade in slaves over a 1,000-mile radius and even reached into the Philippines. 200 years later, California gold rush entrepreneurs such as John Sutter also exploited female Indian labor. Even the Euro-Americans determined to eschew Indian slavery, including Jesuit missionaries, the Mormons, Kit Carson, and the U.S. Army, ended up participating in it. Missions in Sonora became militarized presidios that enslaved and relocated thousands of Seri Indians. Brigham Young eventually temporized with a law that permitted Mormons to ransom captive children and hold them in bondage for 20 years. So you see, all these people, these Jesuit missionaries, Mormons, and all these people that supposedly were trying to help, and they're so religious and Christian, right? They were helping enslave your ancestors as well. One of Resendiz' major contributions is his pursuit of the story of Indian slavery from Spanish America north into the 19th and 20th century United States, showing the continuities. Involuntary servitude continued in California and the Southwest even after the Civil War. Resendiz implies that the other slavery didn't end until well into the 20th century because its many forms made it difficult to stop via statute, and because too many landowners had a stake in its continuance. The book arrives amid a lively debate over slavery and capitalism. While Eric Williams' 1944 Capitalism and Slavery, University of North Carolina Press, suggested that the African slave trade capitalized British industrialization, the other slavery reveals that Indian slavery funded colonization itself, the whole colonization. Moreover, since Indian slavery flourished from large industries to small households and farms, Resendiz works opens up new paths for thinking about how slavery made it possible for many Americans, not just big planters, to participate in the market revolution. Indian slavery is an important part of South Carolina's history that many know nothing about. No other state has as many historic documents that chronicles Native American slavery as South Carolina. For all you who reside in the state of South Carolina, go into the many historic documents that are chronicled there of Native American slavery. Do the research. As the historian Labor concludes, American Indian slaves were most numerous in South Carolina, and the number of Indians exported was larger than that from any other colony. Indian slavery intermingles with every aspect of the colonial record of South Carolina. Indian slavery began soon after settlers arrived and persisted through the colonial period. Knowing about the Indian enslavement is important, impressive, and persistent role in the history of South Carolina, and because it has affected the Native American citizens of the state. Indian slavery contributed to the development of the colony economically, agriculturally, politically, and legally. Indian slavery in colonial South Carolina made a large and indelible mark upon the tribal histories of the American Indians, not only of South Carolina, but of the southeastern United States. In short, the destiny of many of the American Indian tribes of the region was influenced and determined by Indian affairs, which centered in Charlestown. Then we're in the book Indians. Alright, so South Carolina, alright, played a major role in Indian slavery. And this whole time they told us it was Africans growing up in school. And in Virginia and all these places where we're going to keep seeing it was always Indians the whole time. I'm still looking for a reference that says the specific word African. All right, I hope you guys have been paying attention. It hasn't come up much, right? Indian slaves from Caribana, trade and labor in the 17th century Caribbean. And it says here, a number of accounts, deeds, and laws testify to the presence of Indian slaves on Barbados from its first settlement in 1627. Again, a number of accounts, deeds, and laws testify to the presence of Indian slaves on Barbados from its first settlement in 1627, right from the beginning. These were Indians that was always Indians and always was Indians. Deeds used the language Negroes, Indians, and other slaves. All right? So these deeds, they used the same language, right? As in the States, in the North, when they were classifying all your ancestors together and started making tags and these census records. And so these deeds and these islands as well, had language like Negroes, Indians, and other slaves to describe the laboring population attached to the properties sold. The Barbados Laws and Acts printed for Richard Hall in London in 1764 indicates that for all laws passed regarding Indians, one should see slaves. Again, in 1764, the Barbados Laws and Acts indicates that for all laws passed regarding Indians, one should see slaves. All right, so they made it synonymous. During Bacon's rebellion in 1676, the Assembly, at his instigation, declared the enslavement of Indians for life to be legal. Again, during Bacon's rebellion in 1676, the Assembly, at his instigation, declared the enslavement of Indians for life to be legal and made provisions for granting captive Indians to soldiers as a partial inducement to volunteer. The promised reward of slaves as pay for services rendered brought the desired Indian allies. On one occasion, Tom Blunt, chief of the tribe of Friendly Indians in the area of disturbance, in making arrangements with the colonial government for an attack on a certain tribe, specified that his warriors receive payment in captives in failing these and other commodities. All right, so this Tom Blunt, chief of whatever tribe, they're not naming it, but helped the English or American government, right, get captives, right? And he said, you got to give my warriors some of them. All right, that's what he's saying. The Journals of the North Carolina Council for June 25th, 1713, show negotiations between acting Governor Pollock and the council for the purchase of a number of Indians for shipment to the West Indies. For what? For shipment to the West Indies. It was sometimes a problem to provide for the captured Indians. Consequently, in the same year, the Assembly chartered a private sloop to carry away captives brought by friendly Indians. And we're still in the Encyclopedia Virginia.org website. It says here, early forms of slavery during settlement. Slavery, generally absent any modern conception of race, had long been common practice around the world and usually involved the enslavement of war captives. For centuries before European settlement, American Indian tribes had enslaved other Indians as cultural practice, but not as means of recruiting a dominant labor force. The Spanish, in turn, enslaved Indians to work on North American sugar plantations, using the repartimiento and encomienda system. We went over this, right? To apportion Indians and land and to govern their use, respectively. Only when mistreatment decimated whole indigenous populations did the Spanish government, in 1542, outlaw Indian slavery, at least in name. The practice continued indeed. Neither the Spanish nor English immediately sought to enslave the Indians they encountered. Indian slavery did not become official Spanish policy until 1503, or 11 years after its first contact. It is clear that the English wanted to mimic Spanish efforts at creating indigenous tributaries for a labor force, but it took them even longer. The tributary relationship involved the exchange of Indian goods and labor for colonial protection against enemy tribes. Upon their arrival in 1607, the English initially sought to establish this kind of tributary trading relationship with the Algonquin-speaking Indians of Tsenacomoco, a paramount chiefdom, a 28 to 32 small chiefdoms and tribes stretching from the James to the Potomac rivers. The Indians had food the English needed, and the English provided tools, weapons, fabric, and copper-made items the Indians considered to be spiritually valuable. Indians labored for the English as indentured servants without clearly defined rights or lengths of service. All right, without clearly defined rights or lengths of service. So eventually you were basically stuck there doing chattel slave. You became for life, right? You had to fight for it, your freedom back. Conflict soon weakened such relationships. It was slavery more than war or disease that destroyed the small coastal tribes. Again, it was slavery. More than war or disease, slavery. Slavery. So-called Negro, that's you they're talking about. American Indian, colored, mulatto, that's you they're talking about. Slavery more than war or disease was the cause that destroyed the small coastal tribes. As early as 1683, the proprietors had heard that the settlers were making war on Indians around Winyah Bay in order to obtain slaves. Since the proprietors had given permission to sell Indian captives in the West Indies. The trade in slaves was stimulated, and soon the colonists could not distinguish between Indians taken in war and those acquired in other ways. You see what I'm saying? Just like the Spanish. They were using the pretext that these were people being captured in war, and they were just raiding villages and grabbing innocent people. So they just basically started doing that in the English colonies as well. In South Carolina, the Indian captives taken in the early war with the Cusco were sold as slaves by governor and council with the sanction of the proprietors, who, though they had forbidden the enslavement of Indians in the temporary laws sent out to the Governor Sale in 1671, were nevertheless the first to grant the privilege of selling Indian captives from Carolina to the West Indies as the cheapest means of encouraging the soldiers of the infant colony. Accordingly, when war broke out with the Stono Indians in 1680, Governor West, taking advantage of the precedent already established and the express sanction of the proprietors for such an action, offered a price for every Indian that should be taken and brought to Charleston, and obtained the funds he needed for defense by selling the Indians to the traders. Who were these traders? Again, we're in the article Slavery and Native Americans in British North America and the United States. And it says here, the Indian slave trade lasted only until around 1730, and it was characterized by a series of devastating wars among the tribes. Those Indians nearer the European settlements raided tribes farther in the interior in the quest for slaves to be sold, especially to the British. Before 1700, the Westos in Carolina dominated much of the Indian slave trade until the English, allied with the Savannah, who resented Westo control of the trade, wiped them out. The Westo tribal group was completely eliminated. Its survivors were scattered or else sold into slavery in Antigua. A similar pattern of friendly and then hostile relations among the English and Indians followed in the southeastern colonies. For example, the Creek, a loose confederacy of many different groups who had band together to defend themselves against slave raiding, allied with English and moved on the Appalachia in Spanish Florida, destroying them as a group of people in the quest for Indian slaves. These raids also destroyed several other Florida Indian tribes, including the Timucua. Indeed, most of the colonial era Indians of Florida were killed, enslaved, or scattered. It is estimated that English Creek raids, again, English Creek raids on Florida yielded 4,000 Indian slaves between 1700 and 1705. A few years later, the Florida Savannahs, or Shawnee, raided in similar fashion the Cherokee. In North Carolina, the Tuscarora, fearing among other things that the English planned to enslave them, as well as take their land, attacked the English in a war. In a Wichita raid in 1706 on the Choctaw, yielded 300 Indian captives for the English. In response, the French armed the Natchez, who lived on the banks of the Mississippi, and the Illinois against the Chickasaw. By 1729, the Natchez, along with a number of enslaved and runaway blacks who live amongst them, rose up against the French and were massacred in turn by an army composed of French soldiers, Choctaw warriors, and enslaved Africans. Dash the hijack. Indian slaves from Caribana trade and labor in the 17th century Caribbean. And it says here, the rebellion of Metacomb, King Philip's War, 1676-1678, against New England had united multiple indigenous nations. News of this united rebellion created paranoia among the Barbados Assembly, representing the interests of a large plantation owners, about importing Native Americans as slaves to Barbados, as they might incite similar revolts against the colonists. The Barbados legislators did not aim to prevent the import of all Indian slaves, however, but only the Indians from New England, New York, and Rhode Island, who were known to be notorious vigilantes and obstinate, incorrigible rogues and cunning thieves. It would not be until 1688 that the Barbados Assembly decided to outlaw the importation of all Indian slaves to Barbados. which suggests that routes and means of acquiring Indian slaves, apart from connections to North America, had been operating without major opposition for a long time prior to this legislation. All right, did you hear that? Indian slavery was being practiced and operating way before 1688. All right, without major opposition for a long time. Indian slaves from New England and New Netherland, or New York, right, had indeed been a part of the English and Dutch Caribbean landscape since the early 17th century, the early 1600s, meaning even the late 1590s, right? Because going into 1600, right? In Bermuda, English, Providence Island, and we got Providence Island, that's off the coast of Nicaragua and Honduras. They were sending Pequots over there, calling them cannibal Negroes. All right, enslaving the Pequots and sending them to Providence Island, another pilgrim colony, the one they don't teach you about, and Curaçao, Dutch. However, it is unclear how many Indian slaves from North America were in Barbados itself at the time of the 1676 and 1688 acts. In most instances, historians have used sources from New England saying that these captives were sent to the West Indies. Right, West Indies. Historians have guessed that they went to Barbados, since it was the largest recipient of slaves in the English Atlantic for most of the 17th century. For this dissertation, the records reviewed of Indian slaves in Barbados and Suriname do not provide irrefutable evidence of this matter either, since they conflate the origins of all native peoples of the Americas into one category, Indian. Or they note that there are other slaves within it, the list of Negroes. All right, so as you can see, none of these deeds or records says Africans. I hope you've noticed in that. All right, so it's Indian, Negroes, and other slaves. They never say Africans, really, in those times, without indicating who or how many of these others were, right? So they're basically letting you know you can't really know what tribes were there, what American natives were being enslaved from where, what specific places of Americas, because they were just listing them as Indians or Negroes or other slaves. And she's telling you right now, this lady who wrote this paper, these things, they're not indicating who or how many of these others were. They're not really indicating, specifics. Consequently, calculating the exact demographics of Indian slaves on the island, as Jerome S. Handler has noted, is an impossibility. Despite the challenge, identifying the origins of the Indian slaves of Barbados reveals how indigenous people throughout the Caribbean influenced colonization, both on Barbados and through Barbados' influence throughout the Americas. The evidence presented in this dissertation shows that we must start our investigation of Indian slavery more locally, as Worsley suggested, within the Caribbean itself. All right, she's letting you know, if you really want to see foundational truth, you have to really search more locally, not from over there in Africa, but locally, as Worsley suggested, within the Caribbean itself. They were enslaving American Indians. Galley suggests that the Indian captives exported from Carolina from the late 17th century through the 18th century most likely ended up in Barbados. Again, they'll tell us in history books, and when we go read about sugar plantations and all that in Barbados, Jamaica, all that, they'll always keep telling us that they kept getting slaves from West Africa. But when we do the research, through this, through the history, follow the trail, you'll see that in these sources, in these original sources, nobody's talking about Africans. And you'll see that it's actually more American Indians being taken to these places for hundreds of years, like the thousands. All right. Because of the strong trade connections between the two colonies and Barbados' insatiable demand for slaves during this period, however, Galley acknowledges that import records for Barbados do not exist to verify this. My research corroborates that Barbados did indeed have precedents of receiving Indian slaves, but I have only found evidence that they were from the circum-Caribbean region prior to the 1670s. And Caribbean Indians probably continued to be the majority of Indian slaves in Barbados because of the aforementioned legislation preventing North American imports in 1676 and 1687. This dissertation shows that Barbados may not have imported North American Indian slaves before this period, but it did export the tradition of subsuming indigenous people within the category of Negroes, Indians, and other slaves. All right, once again, it did what? It did export the tradition of subsuming indigenous people within the category of Negroes. Negroes. Who? Indians. Negroes. So by the time you get up to the States, now you're a Negro. And then they say, oh, then the Indians started mixing with the Negroes. What you mean is the same people. Are you overstanding, or are you guys getting bored? It's getting late. Shall I continue? Let me get a 1. Let me get a 1 if you want me to continue. Let me get a 1. Are you guys still up? Are you still there? All right, we're about to get to some good parts. I know it's getting late. I'm about to break down some things. All right, we're getting the 1s. All right, we're paying attention. All right, let's go. Into the black coats to North American colonies, making Indians, particularly Carib Indians, subject to an imposed racial identity. They were calling these Carib Indians what? Negroes, Indians, or other slaves. Negroes, black coats. We're in the encyclopediavirginia.org website. Again, it says here, animosity and distrust was growing between the English and the Indians. Indians continued to provide labor under circumstances that, while legally unclear, often amounted to slavery. Everett has argued that deeds and wills from this time period indicate the Indians were inherited within white families and that they were not indentured servants. Indisputably, and by 1661 at the latest, Indians could be and were lifelong servants. In other words, they were slaves. Only after the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, 1644 to 1646, did Indian slavery become a lucrative part of the Virginia economy. The treaty ending the war defined the tribes and chiefdoms of the Senacomoco as tributaries and subjects to English rule, requiring yearly payment to the crown and dictating where Indians could live, hunt, and trade. To coerce Indians to comply with the treaty, the English also demanded that Indian children shall or will freely or voluntarily come in and live with the English, serving as hostage servants in English households. The English claimed they were educating and converting the children to Christianity as part of the tributary system, but many Indians complained that these children were subsequently sold on the slave market. You see what they were doing, right? Who was being sold on the slave market? Indian children. Again, we're in the article Indian Slavery and Servitude in Colonial New England, all right, from Wesleyan University. And it says here, for sale advertisements placed in the Boston newsletter for Indian slaves clearly demonstrate that in the early 18th century or 1700s, Indians, like Africans, were chattel. They were slaves too, just like so-called Africans, right? It was just other Indians, all right? There's not a single advertisement in the Boston newsletter for a white individual, whether Irish, English, or any other nationality, which does not specify their remaining term of service, right? Indentured servitude. Between 1704 and 1717, 29 advertisements were placed in the Boston newsletter selling white servants' time. A white maid might be disposed of for 4 years, or a British servant man, very industrious, fit for farming or any other business, might find his time for about 6 years sold. White servants' times could be sold, but not their bodies. In contrast, Indians were sold alongside Africans as slaves without term limits. Indian women and their infant children were often sold together, revealing the assumption that Indian children would follow their mothers into slavery. Furthermore, Indian slaves were assessed as property for the purpose of taxation. Beginning in 1696, Negro, mulatto, and Indian servants were rated as other personnel estate. All right, so who? Negroes, mulattoes, and Indian servants, they were classed together as what? Other personal estate together, because they're the same people. All right? In the article again, Indian slavery in colonial Georgia, we continue, says, on April 8, 1776, the Georgia Gazette advertised to be sold on Friday the 17th instant at the exchange a handsome young Indian princess. Since Mary Bosworth had already proclaimed herself an Indian princess, the vendue masters Ewin and Bolton doubtless stretched the truth no more than she had done, perhaps in hopes of attracting high bids from local brocels. In 1771, a Spanish fellow, Emmanuel, probably an Indian or a musty from Spanish America, was valued at £60 on the estate of the deceased William Carr near Sunbury. In 1772, George Galpin, who did his business mostly in Georgia, purchased from trader John Mealy an Indian boy captured by the Tomotley Indians in a raid on a plantation in Pensacola Bay. Two other Indian slaves, both probably Native Americans, attempted to escape and were advertised in the Georgia Gazette as runaways. On February 17, 1768, it advertised for a dark Indian fellow, the property of William Lifford, escaped from the Elizabeth and married Captain Samuel Coble's pilot boat. We're still in the article, Slavery and Native Americans in British North America and the United States. And with this part of the article, it says, Native Americans resisted as best they could Anglo-American encroachment on their lands after 1800, as illustrated by the Creek Wars of 1813 and 1836, and a series of wars with the Seminoles that lasted into 1850s. At the same time, the leaders of the major tribes of the southeastern states, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creeks, and Seminole, all right, you see the tribes listed there, right, responded to the overwhelming power of the Anglo-Americans by attempting to imitate their lifestyles. You hear what's going on, right? So they assimilated to the American government, right, to the Anglo-Americans, assimilated to imitate their lifestyles. This adjustment process included accepting the white practice of private land ownership. Listen, working and living on family farms and plantations and acquiring slaves as workers, much as was the case with white slave holders. Indeed, these southeastern Indians came to be known among whites as the civilized tribes. Because, all right, so you're part of the civilized tribes. All right, so you kind of, because of their willingness to embrace the ways of life and slave holders. Indeed, these southeastern Indians came to be known among whites as the civilized tribes because of their willingness to embrace the ways of life and labor identified with Anglo-Americans. All right, so you're part of the civilized tribes. All right, so you kind of like, you know, assimilated with these Anglo-Americans. So you got considered civilized tribe because you were down with them. You went down with their laws and you assimilated to the way of how they lived. All right, so what happened to all the other tribes that did not go down? We're talking about Tecumseh, right? Chickamauga, what are we talking about? Catawba, what are we talking about? So many tribes that we don't know about because they're not considered civilized tribes. They didn't basically, to me, you know what I mean? They held it down. They didn't give in. The seizure of Indians by authority of the colonial government and their subsequent sale were not always above suspicion. At the time of the Narragansett Troubles, in 1646, Plymouth gave legal sanction for the seizure of peaceable and unsuspecting Indians whose tribes were at peace with the English. A second instance of the same character occurred during King Philip's War, shortly after the destruction of Dartmouth in 1675. The Dartmouth Indians had not been concerned in the burning of the town, so the whites entered into the negotiations of peace and friendship with them. The captains of the resident militia and the Plymouth forces sent thither promised them protection, but through other influences they were conducted to Plymouth, and by order of the council, August 4th, 1675, they were sold and transported out of the country, being about 80 persons. So you hear that? So these people said, we want to be at peace, we surrender, we do a treaty with you. They still were sold and transported out of the country. On On September 2nd, 1675, the Council took similar action in the case of a parcel of Indians lately come into Sandwich in a submissive way to this colony. They were adjudged to be in the same condition of rebellion and were condemned, 57 in number, to perpetual servitude. What are we talking about here? Dumb diversus? What are we talking about? Perpetual servitude? A fourth and far more notable instance of bad faith on the part of the English occurred at Cocheco, Dover, New Hampshire, during the Indian difficulties in that section, contemporaneous with the following King Philip's War. Major Waldron was in command of the local garrison and had gathered about him 400 Indians, about 200 of whom were refugees who had fled there for protection after the death of King Philip, which Waldron had promised them. The depredations and Androscoggin Indians at Costco and the devastation of the settlements on the Kennebec caused the Massachusetts government to send a military force into that locality, with orders to seize all Southern Indians wherever they could find them. In obedience to this order, the leaders of the Massachusetts troops wished to seize the Indians at once, but Waldron hesitated to break his promise and proposed a stratagem to avoid disastrous results. His suggestion was followed, and all the Indians were disarmed and made prisoners. September 7, 1676. The strange Indians, or those who had come from the south, 200 in number, were retained and sent to Boston. 7 or 8 who were convicted of having shed English blood were condemned to death. The rest were sold into slavery and foreign parts. The locating of those Indians that remained after the war and the necessity of maintaining order resulted 1677 in the government of Massachusetts settling the groups of Indians, praying as well as unconverted, in various localities, and the distribution of some to remain as servants in English family servants, where they were to be taught and instructed in the Christian religion. Both the captive male Indians and their families were held as slaves. Massachusetts and Plymouth limited the time of servitude of the children of friendly Indians, or those who surrendered and assisted the English, to the time when they should become 24 years of age. The time of service of the children of the Warren Indians was not so limited. So you hear all this, right? You hear this is what we think of slavery. It's not what they taught us. This is actually what was going on. We're going to read more into this, all right? Hope you understand it. Encyclopedia Virginia.org says here, by 1649, the enslavement of children in English households and the stealing of Indian children for the slave market was so common that the General Assembly enacted 2 laws. One stipulating that no tributary children could be sold as slaves, the other that they could not be kept in households after the age of 25. The Assembly passed similar prohibitions in 1655, 1656, and 1657, outlining punishments for anyone stealing and enslaving Indian children. Despite these laws, by the late 17th century, many Indians refused to bring their children to English households due to the threat of enslavement. And even as Virginia prohibited the enslavement of Indian children, the government sometimes encouraged it. Officials in Accomack County, for instance, on June 16, 1670, commissioned a man they called Mr. John to find Indian children to sell to the settlers. Not only were children being enslaved after 1646 treaty, but the treaty's provisions for English dominance led to the practice of enslaving Indians for legal violations, and even as a means of financing war. For instance, when John Powell appealed to the General Assembly in 1660 for damages caused by Indians in Northumberland County, the Assembly responded with a Retribution Act compensating him with the sale of Wico-Comoko Indians, who would be apprehended and sold into a foreign country. The historian Edmund S. Morgan has explained that the casual nature of this act speaks volumes about the acceptability of enslaving Indians by this period. Similarly, in 1666, Governor Sir William Berkeley presided over the General Court and declared that hostilities with the tribes of the Northern Neck be revenged by utter destruction, and that taking their women and children and their goods, example, selling them, would compensate the colony for the cost of the expedition. Although a 1670 law indicated that captives should be servants who are freed at age 30 and not slaves bound to a lifetime of a forced labor, the law was largely ignored. All right, so they say, okay, no, we'll start them out as servants, and they'll be able to, be free at age 30. But this law was largely ignored. After 1646, Indian labor was more common in many forms, from child hostages to indentured servants to slaves. These enslaved Indians worked in the fields and as house servants, interpreters, hunters, and guides. English colonists preferred enslaved Indians, women, and children as domestic laborers rather than African or white laborers because they were considered easiest to train and control. Indian men were perceived to pose a greater risk of obstinacy and escape, and so they were often profitably sold to American buyers as far away as New England or to the sugar plantations in the West Indies where they could not escape. So you see, they're not Africans who are arriving in these places. There's other Indians. We're going to get, if you really do the research, you'll see, chase the trail. You'll see where you end up. You end up with American Indians, not Africans. The historian Everett has argued that when these external markets became available, financial incentive overtook vengeance as the primary driver of Indian enslavement. When the English colonists began to participate in an existing Indian trade that involved slaves and guns, Indian enslavement briefly became an important part of the colonial economy. All right, we're still in the Encyclopedia Virginia.org website, and it says here, trading guns for slaves. By the middle of the 17th century, labor-intense tobacco dominated the Virginia economy, requiring a large and steady workforce. In addition to mostly white indentured servants and African slaves taught to hijack other American Indians, English colonists also relied on enslaved Indians. They were purchased often from other Indians who captured their enemies and traded them to English dealers for English guns. Once some tribes began to be well armed from the gun trade, others were often compelled to enter the market. So as soon as the one tribe was getting, strapped up, you needed to survive, and the other one started, we needed to get guns too. So if they didn't arm themselves with European weapons and enslave other Indians, they would themselves become targets of slavers. As the English increasingly wanted to trade for slaves, and Indians increasingly wanted to trade for guns, the market focused more on slaves while also becoming more violent. Several Indian tribes became prominent slavers in Virginia, including the Rekindle tribe, originally from the area around Lake Erie in New York. The tribe had been displaced by the Iroquois during the Beaver Wars, a series of Indian conflicts during the mid-1600s. In 1656, the Rekindle Indians abandoned their settlements in New York and moved south, seeking trade at the falls of the James River in Henrico County. After settling in Virginia and becoming known as the Westo, they became feared raiders. Initially, Colonel Edward Hill was charged by the General Assembly with non-violently removing the Westo Indians from the region. However, Hill's militia, aided by Pamunkey and Chickahominy forces, fought the Westo at the Battle of Bloody Run in 1656 in Richmond, which resulted in the death of Toto Tomoy Wero Nyans, or chief of the Pamunkey. The assembly subsequently suspended Hill and charged him with paying for an agreement of peace with the tribe. The Westo then secured arrangements with English traders to barter guns for slaves. The colony was less concerned with forcing the Westo Indians into tributary status and more interested in profitable trade. When the Westo vacated their place on the Virginia-Piedmont trading path, members of the Occaneechi tribe living on the falls of the Roanoke River established themselves as the dominant Indian slave brokers in Virginia. As this trade in guns and slaves became larger and more profitable, conflict among tribes increased. Violence erupted on small and large scales. In 1670, for instance, Occaneechi Indians responded to Westo raids, killing Westo Indians aligned with Wood, Huesto and the Ocanichi raids spurred tribal conflict throughout the entire southeast, and many Indians were killed, enslaved, or otherwise scattered. The Slave Code of 1740, which determined the legal destiny of slaves, was to endure to the end of the 18th century. This code, dated May 10, 1740, defined slaves and chattel property, thereby abandoning the definition of slaves continued since 1696. Slavery was thus based upon this law and its comprehensive definition, and not upon customs as it was in the past. So they're talking about, I guess, servitude, indentured servitude. Children of the slaves were to follow the condition of the mother. This was the most comprehensive slave code of the colonial period. It regulated the slave from cradle to grave. After the enactment of the 1740 Slave Code, Indians and descendants of Indians were regarded as free Indians or free people of color. Again. Indians and descendants of Indians were regarded as free Indians or free people of color in amity with the government until the contrary could be shown to differentiate between the enslaved Indians. So they were the free people of color. You are the free people of color, American Indians, descendants of Indians, you, colored, free people of color, you. It is this phrasing in the Code of 1740, which was later interrupted by the courts as the ending of Indian slavery in South Carolina. However, at least 25 Indian slaves are recorded during the 1770s, with 12 of them as runaways and 3 included as a part of the inventory of estates. The concluding phase of Indian slavery in South Carolina was incorporated in a series of laws enacted in the 1790s. A statute enacted on December 21st, 1792, 2 years after the first United States Census, was to prohibit further importation of slaves in the state, which included Indian, mulatto, or mestizo. As late as 1838, Native Americans were in South Carolina fighting for their rights and reevaluating the interpretation of Slave Code of 1740. During the course of Indian slavery in South Carolina, Indians were used in a variety of ways. They were employed in the same ways that Negro slaves were utilized. Again, there was no separation. There still is no separation. It's always been you. You are the so-called American Indian. You are the so-called Negro. It's the same people. As it says here, they were employed in the same ways that Negro slaves were utilized, because it's all the same people. And again, this article was written, it says this article is one of many in the Educational Teacher's Guide, South Carolina Indians Today, edited by William Morrow Goins, PhD. So this is to help, I guess, the teachers in South Carolina. It says here, in February of the following year, 1517, Francisco Hernandez de Cordova sailed from Havana with 3 ships and 110 men. Among them were some noblemen who had come to Cuba but a few months before, and a priest to say mass for them and administer the sacraments. Diego Velazquez, at that time governor of Cuba, had sold the adventurers one of the ships on the condition that it should be paid for in slaves, which were to be secured by making war upon the Indians in the Lucayan Islands, all right, not Africans. These, once again, the Spaniards were enslaving or putting Indians into servitude, not African. So we're in chapter 2 of this book, and it begins with continuing in the last chapter. It was talking about Ponce de Leon. If you guys don't know, one of the first Spanish colonizers. He actually, made it to Florida, one of the first so-called Spaniards to make it to Florida and discover it, supposedly, right? And some of the islands there, like Bimini and other islands near Florida. So it says here, sterile, as was the result of his expedition and the acquisition of gold and slaves. So he was trying to get gold and slaves because he had heard of the Fountain of Youth and gold and all these legends of Florida, all right? Remember, Ponce de Leon. All right, and so he wasn't able to because they kept fighting him. They kept, the ancestors kept fighting him, even though they were getting slaughtered by their canyons and guns. They were still fighting them. They weren't able to penetrate the land. So it says Ponce nonetheless determined to secure possession of his new discovery. Proceeding at once to Spain, he obtained through the influence of his old friend Pedro Núñez de Guzman a second patent dated September 27, 1514, much more explicit than the first, confirming his title. The patent empowered Ponce to settle the island of Bimini and the island of Florida, an island, that's what they thought it was, I guess, which he had discovered, but that he was first required to reduce the Caribs. He needs to reduce the Caribs before proceeding to make his settlement. The grant ran for 3 years from the date of embarkation, and he was further allowed to employ in the attempt at colonization the vessels and men he led against the Caribs. All right? As soon as there should be no further need of his presence, the patent authorized him to build dwelling houses, towns in the island, such as are built in these kingdoms, and even specified in part the details of their construction. It also renewed the command that no one should seek for slaves within his islands without his consent. So don't come looking for slaves here. Where? In Florida and Bimini? All right, so who was there to enslave? Indians, right? So what were the Spanish doing? Enslaving Indians, not Africans. Why did he have to make a law? Why did he have to tell them, yo, don't come over here to enslave? All right, I'm going to enslave these people. I'm going to make them work. All right, because that's what they were doing at that time. Spanish were enslaving Indians, not Africans. And by the thousands at that time, thousands and thousands. All right, so now look at what Ponce is going to say, all right? And I've been telling you that, the Spanish had a type of similar system as indentured servitude. They called encomienda. They had repartimiento, asientos. I mean, they had so many things.